Part 1. The Encounter. Dr. Eliza Carter adjusted the strap of her tan leather tote bag as she stepped out of the sleek black sedan. The driver, a kind, gray-haired man who had been her trusted chauffeur for years, offered her a polite nod and wished her a pleasant flight. She returned the gesture with a warm smile, her gratitude sincere, before heading toward the private terminal of Clearwater Airport. The evening air was cool, carrying the distant hum of airplane engines and a faint whiff of jet fuel. Eliza glanced at her wristwatch. She was early, as usual. Punctuality wasn't just a habit, but a principle that had served her well in building her company, Carter Horizons, a pioneering force in aviation and renewable energy. Tonight's itinerary was supposed to be simple. A quick flight back home after a fulfilling day spent at her foundation's youth mentorship program. Dressed in black jeans, a cream sweater, and a pair of worn but comfortable sneakers, Eliza didn't look like the billionaire CEO she was. Her dark hair was swept back into a no-nonsense ponytail, and she wore no makeup or flashy jewelry. To the untrained eye, she was just another traveler, a detail that often led to underestimations she had learned to navigate with grace. As she stepped into the sleek terminal, the minimalist design caught her eye. The polished floors gleamed under the glow of modern chandeliers, and the space was almost eerily quiet except for the low hum of distant conversation. A few staff members near the check-in desk chatted casually, but none of them acknowledged her presence. Approaching a ground crew member in a crisp uniform who seemed engrossed in his clipboard, she cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I'm here for the Carter jet, scheduled for departure shortly." The man barely glanced up, his eyes quickly scanning her casual attire before settling on her face with a faint frown. "Are you lost? This is the private terminal," he said, his tone clipped. "I'm aware," Eliza replied evenly. "I'm here for my flight." The man raised a skeptical eyebrow and gave her another once-over. "Right? And who are you supposed to be?" Eliza's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her composure. "Dr. Eliza Carter," she replied, her tone firm. "This is my jet." The man let out a dry laugh, more scoff than amusement. "Your jet?" He gestured toward the sleek planes visible through the terminal's expansive windows. "Look, ma'am, this is a terminal for private charters. You might be looking for the commercial terminal down the road." Eliza tilted her head slightly, studying him. His dismissive tone didn't surprise her, but it irritated her nonetheless. She dealt with this kind of presumptuous behavior more times than she cared to count. Deciding to keep things professional, she said simply, "Check the flight manifest. You'll see my name listed." The man hesitated, clearly unsure whether to humor her or send her away. Before he could decide, the glass doors leading to the runway slid open, and a member of the flight crew strode in. The newcomer, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a sharply pressed pilot's uniform, carried himself with an air of authority. He glanced between Eliza and the ground crew member. "What's going on here?" he asked. "This lady says she's here for the Carter jet." The ground crew member replied with a slight sneer. "Claims it's hers." The pilot, Captain Harrison, turned his gaze to Eliza, his expression unreadable but edged with skepticism. "Ma'am, I don't know what you've been told, but this is a private jet reserved for chartered flights. Do you have a ticket or documentation?" Eliza sighed, setting her bag down on the counter. "Captain," she began, keeping her voice steady, "as I've explained, this is my jet. I don't need a ticket. I own it." Harrison's lips twitched into a faint, patronizing smirk. "Is that so? Well, unless you can provide proof of ownership, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. Procedures are procedures." Without a word, Eliza reached into her tote and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she opened the documents that confirmed her ownership of the aircraft and extended the screen toward him. "Here's the registration and proof of ownership," she said coolly. "I suggest you take a closer look." Harrison didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked her up and down. "Listen," he said, his tone sharp. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we don't have time for this. You need to leave before I call security." Eliza considered her options. She could let her frustration boil over, raise her voice, and demand respect. But that wasn't her style. Instead, she stepped back, keeping her expression calm and resolute. "Is this how you treat all your clients, Captain?" she asked, her tone cutting through his condescension like a blade. Harrison blinked, caught off guard by the shift in her demeanor. I don't know what you're implying. You're making assumptions, Eliza said, her voice sharp but steady. You didn't even look at the documentation I provided. Is that your standard protocol, or is this something special just for me? The terminal fell silent. The idle chatter of the nearby staff had stopped, and Eliza could feel their wide-eyed gazes on her. But no one stepped in to help. Silence, she thought. Complicity through silence. I don't have time for this, Harrison said finally, irritation creeping into his voice. I'll get security to sort this out. Eliza stood her ground, her expression unyielding. Go ahead, Captain, she said quietly, but I assure you, this situation won't end the way you think it will. Part 2, Standing Firm. Dr. Eliza Carter remained silent as Captain Harrison walked away, his back stiff with frustration. She could feel the eyes of the other staff members on her, their curiosity thinly veiled as they whispered amongst themselves. Ignoring the weight of their stares, she pulled out her phone and composed a quick message to her assistant, Daniel, asking him to bring additional documentation and to record everything. This was going to be handled her way, with professionalism and dignity. She refused to stoop to their level, no matter how tempting it might be. Picking up her bag, Eliza moved to the side of the terminal, standing tall and poised despite the simmering frustration that boiled beneath the surface. One thing was certain, this situation wasn't going to end the way they expected. Not even close. She positioned herself by the large glass window, her reflection faintly visible against the darkening sky. Beyond the glass, the runway lights flickered as planes taxied to and from their gates. Eliza clenched her phone tightly in her hand, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't new, the assumptions, the dismissals. It was an experience she'd encountered too many times to count. Yet, no matter how often it happened, it still stung. It was a subtle, constant reminder of the biases that thrived beneath polished professionalism. Behind her, the low murmur of Captain Harrison's voice reached her ears. He was speaking with the ground crew, their hushed conversation interrupted by occasional glances in her direction. Eliza didn't turn around. Instead, she focused on her breathing, her calm exterior, a weapon she'd honed over years of facing such situations. From somewhere nearby, she heard someone mutter, "Unbelievable." Curious, she turned her head slightly and caught sight of a young flight attendant who had just walked in. The woman, blonde and impeccably dressed, was looking at Eliza with a mixture of confusion and disdain. Whispering something to another crew member, the pair exchanged glances before laughing quietly. Eliza's shoulders stiffened, but she refused to react. This was familiar. She had seen the same judgmental expressions in boardrooms, in high-end boutiques, even at industry conferences. It was the unspoken narrative she was far too accustomed to. You don't belong here. Her phone buzzed, pulling her focus. A message from Daniel lit up the screen. On my way. 5 minutes out. Let me know if they're still giving you trouble. She quickly typed back. Thanks. Bring the full ownership file. We might need it. Slipping her phone back into her bag, she turned her attention back to the terminal just as Captain Harrison approached again. This time, he wasn't alone. The blonde flight attendant stood beside him, her arms folded and a smirk playing on her lips. Ma'am, Harrison began, his tone a practiced blend of forced politeness and impatience. We have a tight schedule tonight, and I don't want to hold things up unnecessarily. If you could just step aside until security arrives, we'll get this sorted quickly. Eliza met his gaze evenly, her voice calm. I've already provided documentation. There's no need to involve security. The flight attendant scoffed, her smirk widening. Look, if you're trying to pull some kind of stunt, it's not going to work. We've seen this before. Eliza raised an eyebrow. Have you? She asked, her voice still measured but sharp enough to cut. Please enlighten me. What exactly do you think I'm trying to do? The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard by the direct question. Well, I mean, you're claiming to own this jet. It's just not very likely, is it? And why is that? Eliza pressed, her tone laced with quiet steel. The flight attendant faltered, glancing at Captain Harrison for support. He cleared his throat. Look, we're not here to debate this. This is a private terminal, and unless you can provide proper identification, we can't let you board. Eliza sighed, feeling the familiar weariness of having to defend herself yet again. She reached into her bag and pulled out her driver's license, holding it up for them to see. Here's my ID. It has my name, the same name that's listed on the jet's registration, the same registration you've refused to check. I'm giving you another chance to correct your mistake. Harrison glanced at the license but didn't take it. Instead, he crossed his arms. You could have printed that anywhere, he said dismissively. Eliza's patience was wearing thin. She fixed him with a steady gaze. You haven't verified anything because you've already decided that I don't belong here. Am I wrong? The captain shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't answer. The flight attendant, however, scoffed again. Let's not make this about something it's not. Eliza took a step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what exactly do you think this is about? The tension in the room was palpable. Nearby staff members suddenly found reasons to busy themselves, avoiding eye contact but clearly listening. Eliza could see their discomfort, the way they fidgeted and glanced at her from the corners of their eyes. Complicity through silence, she thought grimly. Always the same. Before anyone could respond, the glass doors slid open again. Daniel strode in, his sharp suit and confident demeanor commanding attention. His arrival was a stark contrast to the unease radiating from Captain Harrison and the flight attendant. Eliza, Daniel said with a nod, his tone professional but warm. I have the full ownership documents with me. Eliza allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross her lips. The game was about to change. Part 3, the evidence. Daniel, carrying a sleek leather briefcase, strode confidently into the terminal, his professional demeanor radiating calm authority. He quickly assessed the situation, his sharp eyes landing on Dr. Eliza Carter. Dr. Carter, he said with a small nod, his tone steady and reassuring. I've brought the documents you requested. The flight crew exchanged uneasy glances, confusion and doubt flickering across their faces. Daniel handed the file to Eliza, who opened it methodically. She held up the official ownership papers for the jet, her voice firm and unwavering. This, she began, gesturing to the document, is the FAA registration for this aircraft. My name is clearly listed as the owner. Are you going to continue wasting my time, or are you ready to acknowledge your mistake? Captain Harrison hesitated, his face flushing a deep red. He took a step closer, leaning in to glance at the papers, but he made no move to take them from her. Anyone could forge documents, he muttered under his breath. Daniel raised an eyebrow, his expression incredulous. That's quite an accusation. Do you even realize who you're speaking to? The blonde flight attendant folded her arms, a defiant frown on her face. She hasn't proven anything, she insisted. Eliza cut her off, her patience clearly worn thin. Enough, she said sharply. I've been patient, but this is beyond unprofessional. You've refused to verify the documentation I've provided. You've made baseless assumptions about who I am. And now, you're accusing me of forgery. Is this how you treat all your clients, or am I just a special case? Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, daring them to refute the truth. For a moment, silence enveloped the room. The other staff members exchanged nervous glances, fully aware that the situation was spiraling out of control. Finally, Captain Harrison straightened his posture, his face hardening as he tried to regain control. I'll contact the terminal manager, he said stiffly. They'll handle this. Eliza nodded, her expression calm but unyielding. Go ahead, and while you're at it, think about how this will reflect on you when they confirm that I own this jet. Harrison turned on his heel and walked away, the blonde flight attendant trailing closely behind him. Eliza watched them leave, her composure steady despite the tension simmering in the room. Daniel leaned in, his voice low. Do you want me to escalate this? Not yet, Eliza replied quietly, her eyes focused on the darkening sky outside. Let's see how far they're willing to dig this hole for themselves. She turned back to the window, her reflection sharper now against the glass. This wasn't just about her. This was about standing up for anyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or disrespected for not fitting into someone else's narrow expectations. From across the room, she could hear snippets of Captain Harrison's conversation with the blonde flight attendant as they moved toward an office. Words like manager and situation floated back to her. Eliza glanced at Daniel, who had already set up his laptop at a nearby counter. "I've pulled up the entire ownership history of the jet," he said, his tone professional and measured. "Just in case they try to claim they can't verify it, do you want me to send it to the terminal manager now?" "Not yet," Eliza said, shaking her head. "Let's see how they handle this on their own. I want to give them every opportunity to show their true colors." Daniel nodded, though his lips tightened in frustration. He had worked with Eliza long enough to understand her strategic approach. Calm, calculated, and always in control. But even he couldn't hide the mounting irritation in his eyes. Eliza turned her attention back to the terminal. A few other passengers were seated in the lounge area, casting furtive glances in her direction. It was obvious they had overheard parts of the interaction, but none of them seemed inclined to intervene. One man in a tailored suit pretended to read a magazine, though his eyes flicked toward her every few moments. A woman clutching a designer handbag leaned toward her companion, whispering while occasionally darting judgmental glances at Eliza. The silent judgment wasn't new to her, but it was no less exhausting. She thought of all the times she had been underestimated, questioned, or ignored simply because she didn't fit the image people expected. Despite her success, her wealth, and her influence, there was always someone eager to assume she didn't belong. Minutes later, Captain Harrison returned with another man in tow. The newcomer, dressed in a crisp gray suit, exuded an air of authority. His expression was a careful blend of professionalism and wariness, as though he had been dragged into a situation he didn't fully understand, but knew he needed to manage. He approached Eliza with a forced smile, extending a hand. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Richard Bennett, the terminal manager. Captain Harrison has informed me there's been some confusion regarding your flight." Eliza shook his hand but didn't return the smile. Her gaze was steady, almost piercing. "There's no confusion, Mr. Bennett. I've already provided documentation proving that I own the jet in question. Your staff has refused to verify it and instead called you in to, what? Mediate a situation that shouldn't exist in the first place." Bennett's smile faltered. He glanced briefly at Harrison, who stood rigidly behind him, his face a mask of defensiveness. "I assure you, Dr. Carter, we take every claim seriously, but we do have protocols to follow for security purposes." Eliza's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone cool. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like your protocols include ignoring valid documentation, making baseless accusations, and treating your clients with disrespect. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?" Bennett hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. Behind him, Captain Harrison's expression tightened, and the blonde flight attendant looked away, avoiding Eliza's gaze. Eliza folded her arms, her voice cutting through the silence. "I suggest you take a closer look at the documents I've provided, Mr. Bennett. And while you're at it, consider how this situation reflects on your staff's professionalism, or lack thereof." Part 4. A firm reminder. Richard Bennett, the terminal manager, cleared his throat. "If you'll allow me to review the documents, Dr. Carter, we can resolve this quickly," he said with a polite yet slightly cautious tone. Eliza handed him the file Daniel had prepared. Bennett opened it, his eyes scanning the neatly organized pages with growing seriousness. Daniel, standing nearby, crossed his arms, his expression calm but knowing. "Everything is in order," Eliza said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of her authority. "FAA registration, ownership transfer documents, maintenance logs, every detail is there." Bennett nodded slowly, his focus still on the papers. His expression grew more apologetic with each page he turned. Finally, he closed the file and looked up at Eliza. "This all appears to be legitimate," he admitted. "I apologize for any inconvenience, Dr. Carter. I'll ensure you're able to board your jet immediately." Captain Harrison stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Sir, with all due respect, how do we know these documents aren't forged? I've seen people try to bluff their way onto private aircraft before." Bennett hesitated, clearly caught between deferring to Harrison's position as a pilot and acknowledging the legitimacy of the evidence in his hands. Eliza, however, had reached the end of her patience. Her voice, steady yet edged with unmistakable authority, cut through the tension like a knife. "Let me make this very simple for you," she said. "I am Dr. Eliza Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Horizons, one of the most successful aviation companies in the world. This jet is not only mine. It was designed and manufactured by my company. If you continue to question my ownership, I will consider it a personal attack and will not hesitate to take legal action against everyone involved." Her words hung heavy in the air, silencing the room. Even the passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly staring, their curiosity and surprise plain on their faces. Bennett cleared his throat again, visibly flustered. "There's no need for that, Dr. Carter," he said quickly. "I assure you we'll resolve this immediately." "Good," Eliza replied, her gaze shifting to Harrison. "I suggest you have a conversation with your crew about professionalism and bias, because their behavior tonight has been nothing short of unacceptable." Harrison opened his mouth, as if to respond, but a sharp glance from Bennett silenced him. Instead, the captain turned on his heel and stalked away, muttering under his breath. Bennett offered Eliza another strained smile. "Again, I deeply apologize for this situation. I'll personally ensure your flight is prepared for takeoff as soon as possible." Eliza didn't respond immediately. She held his gaze, her expression unwavering and unyielding, before giving a single, deliberate nod. "See that you do," she said. As Bennett hurried off to make arrangements, Daniel leaned in slightly. "Do you think they've learned their lesson?" he asked quietly, his tone tinged with dry amusement. Eliza allowed herself a faint, humorless smile. "Not yet," she said, "but they will." She returned to her seat by the terminal window, her posture as composed and commanding as ever. Outside, her jet sat gleaming under the runway lights, a silent testament to her success. It stood in stark contrast to the way she had just been treated, a reminder of how far she had come and how far society still had to go. Daniel sat beside her, already back to work. His laptop screen glowed faintly as his fingers flew across the keyboard, gathering additional documentation and sending emails to the necessary parties. His efficiency was comforting. Eliza knew Daniel could handle anything, and she appreciated his unwavering support, especially in moments like this. The terminal buzzed quietly with muted activity. Staff members hurried past, most avoiding eye contact with her altogether. The low hum of announcements over the PA system mixed with the faint murmur of conversations. Eliza could feel the weight of curiosity pressing down on her from the other passengers in the lounge. Some openly stared, their expressions a mix of fascination and discomfort, while others stole quick glances, pretending to be preoccupied with their phones or magazines. "Any word from Bennett?" Eliza asked, her eyes fixed on the jet outside. Daniel glanced at his phone. "He said he's contacting a new crew to replace the one currently assigned. Shouldn't be long now." Eliza nodded, acknowledging the effort, but knowing the damage had already been done. Moments like these weren't just inconveniences. They were reminders of the systemic challenges she faced, even at the peak of her career. As she leaned back in her chair, her mind began to turn toward the next steps. This wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent. If she could ensure that this kind of treatment didn't happen to the next person or the next 100 people, it would be worth every moment of frustration. Tonight wasn't over yet, and Eliza was ready for whatever came next. Part 5. A Turning Point. The reminders of the systemic challenges Eliza Carter faced lingered in her mind, no matter how successful or powerful she had become. Yet she was resolute. This wasn't just about her. She was determined to see it through for every person who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or underestimated. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from her legal team appeared on the screen. "We've prepared a full incident report. Let us know if you'd like us to escalate this to the airline's board or involve external counsel." Eliza quickly typed back a response. "Hold off for now. I'll assess the situation once I'm airborne." The idea of taking this straight to the board was tempting, but Eliza knew the value of a carefully executed strategy. She wanted to approach the issue in a way that left no room for excuses or deflection. Tapping her fingers rhythmically on the armrest, she leaned back and waited. A commotion near the check-in desk caught her attention. Captain Harrison had returned, his face flushed with poorly concealed anger. He was speaking in hushed but tense tones to a junior staff member, gesturing sharply as his frustration visibly bubbled over. Though Eliza couldn't make out the exact words, his body language made it clear that his pride had taken a significant hit. Nearby, the blonde flight attendant stood awkwardly, glancing nervously in Eliza's direction, as if worried she might be dragged into another confrontation. "Looks like Harrison isn't handling this well," Daniel remarked, following her gaze. "No, he isn't," Eliza replied evenly, her tone calm but firm. "But that's not my concern. His behavior speaks for itself." Daniel chuckled, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Want me to record his little meltdown? Could come in handy later." Eliza allowed herself a quiet laugh. "Let's not stoop to their level. Besides, we already have more than enough evidence." They both watched as Harrison finally stormed off, his expression a mix of frustration and humiliation. The junior staff member he'd been berating exhaled in visible relief and returned to his duties without a word. A few minutes later, Richard Bennett returned, his stride brisk but his demeanor professional. Approaching Eliza, he clasped his hands in front of him and offered her an apologetic smile. "Dr. Carter," he began, "thank you for your patience. I've arranged for a new flight crew to replace the previous one, and I've personally reviewed their credentials to ensure they meet the highest standards of professionalism. Your jet is being prepared for immediate departure." Eliza studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," she said at last, her tone cool but polite. "I appreciate your efforts to resolve this situation." Bennett hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but feeling compelled to address the situation further. "I want to assure you that this incident does not reflect the values of our terminal or our staff. We pride ourselves on delivering the highest level of service to all our clients." Eliza's gaze sharpened. "Do you?" she asked, her voice cutting through his attempt at reassurance. "Because what I experienced tonight suggests otherwise." Bennett's face reddened slightly, and he swallowed hard. "I understand your frustration, Dr. Carter, and I assure you that we will be conducting a full review of tonight's events. Appropriate action will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen again." Eliza leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Good, because if I find that this kind of behavior persists, I won't hesitate to escalate the matter. I expect accountability, Mr. Bennett, not just apologies." He nodded quickly, his grip tightening on the folder he held. "Of course, Dr. Carter, we take this very seriously." Satisfied for now, Eliza leaned back in her chair and dismissed him with a slight nod. Bennett gave a small bow of his head before hurrying off, leaving her alone with Daniel once more. "Think he'll follow through?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his own seat. "He doesn't have a choice," Eliza replied, her tone resolute. "Not after the spotlight we've put on this." Daniel grinned. "I love it when you're in full CEO mode." Eliza allowed herself a faint smile. "It's not about being a CEO, Daniel. It's about demanding the respect we all deserve." As the new crew arrived, Eliza watched them from her seat. They carried themselves with professionalism and efficiency, their interactions precise and respectful. One of them, a young black woman in a crisp uniform, caught Eliza's eye and offered a warm, genuine smile. Eliza returned the gesture, feeling a small flicker of hope. Perhaps change was possible after all. When the preparations were finally complete, Daniel gathered his things and stood. "Shall we?" Eliza rose gracefully, her presence commanding even in the simplest of actions. She walked toward the gate with measured, purposeful steps, Daniel at her side. As she approached the jet, she felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, their curiosity palpable. She didn't look back. Her focus was on the path ahead, knowing that tonight's events were just one chapter in a much larger story. When she stepped onto the jet, the new crew greeted her with genuine warmth and respect. Eliza took her seat, her posture calm and poised. Outside, the jet gleamed under the runway lights, a silent reminder of her success and the battles she'd fought to achieve it. The weight of the evening began to lift slightly as the engines hummed to life, signaling the next stage of her journey. Yet Eliza's thoughts remained sharp and purposeful. This wasn't just about overcoming one incident, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to. As the jet began to taxi toward the runway, Eliza leaned back, her resolve unshaken. Tonight wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Part 6. Reflections in Flight. As the engines roared to life, Daniel settled into his seat across from Dr. Eliza Carter, his laptop already open as he prepared for the next task. The jet taxied onto the runway, the hum of activity outside fading into the background. Eliza turned her gaze to the window, watching the soft glow of the lights at the Highland terminal fade into the distance. Her thoughts lingered on the people she had encountered that night, their assumptions, biases, and their refusal to look past the surface. It wasn't a new experience, but it was always worth standing up to. As the jet ascended, Eliza closed her eyes, letting a sense of calm wash over her. The immediate battle was behind her, but the broader fight for equity and respect was far from over. She knew she would be ready for whatever came next. Leaning back in the plush leather seat of her jet, the soft hum of the engines served as a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. It had been an exhausting evening, but as the plane climbed higher into the sky, relief and satisfaction began to settle in. Daniel, seated across from her, was busy typing furiously, his focus unwavering, as the cabin remained quiet. The occasional clink of glasses could be heard as the new crew moved efficiently, their professionalism a stark contrast to the earlier experience. Eliza glanced at the crew. They were respectful, attentive, and polished. It was a clear reminder of how the right people in the right roles could transform an experience entirely. Turning her attention to the window, she watched the city lights below shrink into a sea of darkness. Her faint reflection stared back at her, calm yet contemplative. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrest as she replayed the night's events in her mind. The dismissive glances, the condescending tones, the blatant refusal to acknowledge her authority, it all painted a clear picture of biases deeply embedded in the system. "I've drafted a statement," Daniel said, breaking the silence. He turned his laptop toward her, revealing a glowing document on the screen. "Something we can release if you decide to take this public." Eliza leaned forward, her eyes scanning the text. It was succinct yet impactful, outlining the events of the evening and calling for accountability without veering into sensationalism. She nodded, impressed by Daniel's ability to strike the perfect tone. "This is good," she said finally, leaning back. "But let's hold off for now. I want to see how the terminal and the airline respond before we make any public moves. If they handle this internally and show they're serious about change, I'd rather work with them than against them." Daniel tilted his head thoughtfully. "You think they'll follow through?" "I think they'll try," Eliza replied. "Whether that's because they want to do the right thing, or they're just afraid of bad PR, that's another question. Either way, I'm giving them the opportunity to act before I escalate." Daniel leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're a lot more patient than I'd be." Eliza shrugged lightly. "It's not about patience. It's about strategy. Making the right move at the right time." Their conversation was interrupted by the soft approach of the new flight attendant. Her name tag read Rhea, and her warm smile accompanied the glass of water she offered. "Is there anything else I can get you, Dr. Carter?" Rhea asked, her tone polite but genuine. Eliza shook her head. "This is perfect, thank you." Rhea nodded and turned to Daniel, offering him the same attentive service before retreating back to the galley. Daniel raised an eyebrow, a faint grin on his face. "Now that's how you treat a client." Eliza smiled faintly but didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her phone and opened her email, scrolling through updates from her team and legal counsel. One email caught her eye. It was from the director of her company's Diversity and Inclusion (D&I) initiative, detailing the progress of their mentorship program for underrepresented groups in aviation. Her mood lifted slightly as she read about the program's successes. It had been one of her greatest passions. A way to create opportunities for others and ensure future generations wouldn't face the barriers she had encountered. Tonight's events only reinforced the importance of that work. "Daniel," Eliza said, looking up from her phone. "Remind me to set up a meeting with the D&I team next week. I want to talk about expanding the mentorship program. We need to do more outreach, especially in areas where opportunities are limited." "Consider it done," Daniel replied, pulling up his calendar to make a note. As the flight continued, Eliza's thoughts drifted back to the early days of her career. She had been the only black woman in rooms filled with older men who barely acknowledged her presence. She remembered the doubts she had faced, the whispered comments, and the unspoken expectation that she prove herself over and over again. But she also remembered the victories, the contracts she had won, the innovations she had spearheaded, and the milestones she had reached, solidifying her place in an industry that hadn't been built for someone like her. Those moments of triumph were what fueled her resolve to keep pushing forward. The cabin remained quiet, save for the faint hum of the engines and the occasional shuffle of the crew moving about. Eliza's determination only grew as she stared out at the night sky. The journey wasn't just hers anymore, it was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Part 7. The next step. Eliza Carter's thoughts lingered on her journey. She remembered the doubts, the whispered comments, and the constant pressure to prove herself in rooms where she had been the only one who looked like her. Yet, alongside those struggles, she also recalled the triumphs, the contracts she had secured, the groundbreaking innovations she had led, and the milestones that had solidified her place in the industry. She thought about the mentors who had supported her and the younger professionals she now guided in return. Each step of her path had been a battle hard fought, and tonight's events were just another chapter in that ongoing story. Her musings were interrupted by Daniel clearing his throat. "Just got a message from the airline's CEO," he said, glancing at his phone. "They want to schedule a meeting to discuss what happened tonight. Looks like they're taking this seriously." Eliza nodded, unsurprised. "Good. I want to hear what they have to say. Set it up for Monday." Daniel made a note, then looked up at her. "What's the end game here? What do you want from them?" "Accountability," Eliza replied without hesitation. "I want them to acknowledge what happened, take responsibility, and implement real, lasting changes. Training, new policies, whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Daniel smiled. "You're going to make them regret underestimating you." "It's not about making them regret it," Eliza said calmly. "It's about making them better." The rest of the flight passed quietly. The tension from the evening gradually gave way to a sense of purpose. As the jet began its descent, Eliza looked out the window at the city lights sparkling below. A renewed determination filled her. Tonight had been a battle, but it wasn't the end. It was a reminder of why she fought so hard and why she would continue to do so. When the jet landed and taxied to the private hangar, Eliza gathered her belongings with deliberate, composed movements. Stepping off the plane into the cool night air, she felt the weight of the evening lift slightly, replaced by the steady resolve that had carried her through countless challenges before. This wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The following Monday arrived under a bright, clear sky. It was the kind of day that might have lifted Eliza's spirits, if not for the meeting that loomed ahead. The CEO of Stratus Airlines had requested an in-person discussion to address the incident at the Highland terminal, and Eliza had agreed. However, her acceptance came with a mix of skepticism and determination. She wasn't interested in empty apologies or damage control. She wanted real accountability. Daniel drove them to the airline's corporate headquarters in the bustling heart of the city. The sleek black car moved smoothly through the busy streets. Eliza sat in the back, her tablet balanced on her lap as she reviewed her notes and reports. The hum of traffic outside barely registered as she prepared herself for the meeting. "They'll try to placate you," Daniel said from the driver's seat, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Polished apology, maybe some vague promises to look into the issue." "I know," Eliza replied, not looking up. "That's why I'm going to make it clear that words aren't enough. This isn't just about me, it's about their entire culture." Daniel smirked. "They picked the wrong person to underestimate." Eliza gave him a faint smile but didn't respond. Instead, she tapped her stylus against her tablet, scrolling through the detailed agenda she had outlined for the meeting. She had no intention of walking in unprepared. Every point she planned to make was backed by evidence, and every demand she intended to voice was supported by data. Precision and thoroughness had been the cornerstones of her career, and today would be no exception. When they arrived at the Stratus Airlines headquarters, the towering glass building gleamed under the midday sun. Inside the expansive lobby, the polished floors reflected the opulent decor, but Eliza remained unfazed. She had walked into spaces like this countless times, always with the same quiet resolve to prove her worth in environments that often doubted her right to be there. "This way, Dr. Carter," a receptionist said with a polite smile, leading her and Daniel to the elevator bank. The ride to the top floor was silent, the hum of the elevator almost meditative. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a small group of executives waiting in a tastefully decorated lounge. A tall man with salt and pepper hair stepped forward, extending his hand. "Dr. Carter, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I'm Charles Linton, CEO of Stratus Airlines." Eliza shook his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for reaching out," she replied. "I trust you understand the importance of this discussion." "Absolutely," Linton said, gesturing toward a nearby conference room. "Please, come in. We've prepared some materials to share with you, and we're eager to hear your perspective." Eliza and Daniel followed him into the room, where several other executives were seated around a sleek oval table. The walls were lined with screens displaying the airline's branding and charts of their operations. Eliza took her seat at the head of the table, her presence commanding the room without effort. The meeting was about to begin, and she was ready to hold them accountable for the changes she demanded. Part 8. The Boardroom Challenge. Charles Linton gestured toward a nearby conference room, his polished demeanor unchanged. "Please, come in. We've prepared some materials to share with you, and we're eager to hear your perspective." Dr. Eliza Carter and Daniel followed him into the sleek, modern space. Several other executives were already seated around an elegant oval table. The walls lined with large screens displaying Stratus Airlines' logo and statistics about their operations. Eliza took her seat at the head of the table, her commanding presence palpable without effort. Linton began with a carefully rehearsed opening statement, expressing regret over the incident and emphasizing the airline's commitment to diversity and inclusion. His tone was polished, his words deliberate. While he wasn't entirely insincere, Eliza could sense the underlying intent to contain the situation. "While we acknowledge that the experience you had was unacceptable," Linton said, "we want to assure you that this was an isolated incident. It does not reflect the values of Stratus Airlines or our commitment to providing equitable service to all our clients." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but pointed. "An isolated incident? Are you certain about that?" Linton hesitated, caught off guard. Because, from my perspective," Eliza continued, her voice steady and firm, "this isn't about one flight crew or one terminal manager. This is about a systemic issue, one that reflects broader biases and assumptions that permeate your organization." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the table. Linton exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, a woman sitting to his left who looked equally uncomfortable but intrigued. "I didn't come here today for an apology," Eliza said, leaning forward slightly. "I came for solutions. I want to know what steps you're prepared to take to ensure that no one else has to experience what I did. And I'm not talking about surface-level fixes or performative measures. I'm talking about real, structural change." Linton cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We've been reviewing our policies and procedures, and we're open to implementing additional training for our staff. We also plan to conduct an internal audit to identify any areas where we might be falling short." "That's a start," Eliza acknowledged, her tone measured. "But it's not enough. Training without accountability is meaningless. How do you plan to track the effectiveness of this training? What metrics will you use to measure progress? And what consequences will there be for employees who fail to meet the standards you set?" Linton hesitated again, and the woman beside him, whom Eliza recognized as the company's chief diversity officer, finally spoke up. "Dr. Carter raises valid points," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Accountability is key, and it's something we need to integrate into our approach. If we're going to address these issues effectively, we need more than just policies. We need a cultural shift." Eliza nodded, appreciating the woman's input. "Exactly. And that cultural shift starts at the top. What kind of message are you sending to your employees when incidents like this are brushed off as isolated events?" Linton exhaled heavily, clearly feeling the pressure. "You're right. We need to do better. Dr. Carter, would you be willing to consult with us as we develop a comprehensive plan to address these issues?" Eliza considered the offer carefully. She had expected something like this, a way for them to leverage her expertise while also involving her in the process. It was a delicate balance, but one she could navigate. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But I have conditions. First, I want full transparency throughout this process. That means regular updates, clear timelines, and measurable goals. Second, I want to see a commitment to diversity, not just in your lower ranks, but in your leadership. Representation matters, and it starts at the top." Linton nodded, though he looked slightly overwhelmed. "Understood. We'll work on drafting a proposal that aligns with your expectations." Eliza leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "I'm not here to make demands for the sake of making demands. I'm here because I believe in the power of accountability to create real change. If you're serious about this, you'll have my full support. But if I see any signs that this is just lip service, I won't hesitate to take this public." Linton's expression tightened, but he nodded again. "We understand, and we're committed to making this right." The meeting continued for another hour, with Eliza outlining specific recommendations and strategies for fostering a more inclusive and equitable environment. She pushed them to think critically, to address root causes rather than symptoms, and to implement meaningful change. By the time the meeting ended, Eliza felt a cautious sense of optimism. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. As she and Daniel left the building, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, Daniel turned to her with a grin. "You just made an entire room of executives sweat bullets. That was incredible." Eliza allowed herself a small smile, her resolve unwavering. "It's not about making them sweat, Daniel. It's about making them better." Part 9. Turning the Tide. "That was incredible," Daniel said, grinning as he climbed into the car with Dr. Eliza Carter. "You just made an entire room of executives sweat bullets." Eliza smiled faintly, her resolve as firm as ever. "This isn't about making them sweat," she replied. "It's about making them better." With that, she settled into the seat, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The aftermath of the meeting began to unfold almost immediately. By the time Eliza returned to her sleek office that evening, her inbox was flooded with follow-ups. Some emails were from Charles Linton, the CEO of Stratus Airlines, outlining the company's next steps and reiterating their commitment to reform. Others were from journalists who had caught wind of the incident, eager for interviews. The story was spreading fast. Although Eliza hadn't made a public statement yet, she knew it was only a matter of time before the media frenzy intensified. Sitting at her minimalist glass desk, she scrolled through her emails with practiced efficiency. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow over the room. Across from her, Daniel worked diligently, organizing notes from the meeting as his laptop screen illuminated his focused expression. "They're definitely in damage control mode," Daniel said without looking up. Linton just sent another email. He's proposing a press conference to announce the changes they're planning to implement. Eliza leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "A press conference might help their image," she said, "but it won't mean anything unless their actions back it up. What's the timeline on the internal audit they mentioned?" Daniel clicked through a few documents. "They're aiming to complete it within 3 months. After that, they'll release a report with their findings." 3 months, Eliza repeated, tapping her fingers against the armrest. "That's reasonable, but I'll need to keep the pressure on them. If they think I'll forget about this once the headlines fade, they're mistaken." Daniel smirked. "Oh, they'll learn. Trust me." Eliza's phone buzzed, pulling her attention from her thoughts. It was a call from Dana, a close friend and civil rights attorney who had been following the situation closely. "Dana," Eliza said, leaning forward as her friend's familiar voice filled the room. "Eliza, I just saw the initial reports about what happened at the terminal. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Eliza assured her. "It was frustrating, but it's not the first time I've dealt with something like this. It just happened to play out very publicly this time." Dana sighed audibly. "It's disgusting that you even have to deal with this at all. But I saw what you did at the meeting with Stratus Airlines. You handled it perfectly." "Thanks," Eliza said, her tone softening slightly. "I just hope it leads to real change. The last thing I want is for this to become another empty PR stunt." "I don't think they'll risk that," Dana replied confidently. "Not with you involved. You've got the leverage, Eliza. Use it." Eliza smiled faintly, grateful for her friend's encouragement. That's the plan. After ending the call, she sat quietly for a moment, her thoughts swirling. The incident was a stark reminder of the systemic challenges she still faced, even as one of the most successful women in her field. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to push for meaningful change, not just at Stratus Airlines but across the entire aviation industry. "Daniel," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel looked up from his laptop. "What's up?" "I want to draft an op-ed," Eliza said. "Something that addresses what happened, but focuses on the bigger picture." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You want to go public with your side of the story?" "Not just my side," Eliza clarified. "I want to highlight the systemic issues that led to this. The biases, the assumptions, the lack of accountability. It's bigger than me. If I can use my platform to start a conversation, I'm going to do it." Daniel nodded, already opening a new document on his laptop. "What angle are you thinking?" Eliza tapped her chin thoughtfully. "I want to talk about how progress isn't just about diversity in hiring. It's about creating environments where everyone feels valued and respected. It's about holding people accountable when they fall short. And it's about leaders setting the standard." As Daniel began typing, Eliza dictated her ideas, her voice growing steadier and more determined with every word. By the time they finished the first draft, it was well past midnight, but neither of them seemed to mind. The piece was powerful, direct, and unflinching, a reflection of the woman who had written it. The next morning, the op-ed was published in a major newspaper, accompanied by a striking photo of Eliza standing in front of her jet. The headline read, "Bias at 30,000 feet. Why Accountability Matters in Every Industry." The article quickly went viral, sparking widespread discussions on social media and garnering praise from activists, industry leaders, and everyday readers alike. Eliza spent the day fielding calls and messages from colleagues and supporters. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others expressed admiration for her courage and leadership. The response was overwhelming, but deeply validating. As Eliza scrolled through her inbox that evening, her resolve solidified even further. She had always believed in the power of her voice, and now she had proof that it could make a difference. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Eliza was ready for the next chapter. Part 10, Building a Movement. As Eliza Carter reflected on the overwhelming response to her op-ed, she found it deeply validating. Messages poured in. Some shared personal stories of bias, while others expressed admiration for her courage and leadership. It was proof of what she had always believed. The power of her voice could create real change. By the end of the day, even Charles Linton, the CEO of Stratus Airlines, called her directly. "Your article was powerful, Dr. Carter," he said, his tone earnest. "It's a reminder of why this work is so important. We're committed to seeing this through." "I'm glad to hear that," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "Because the work is just beginning." As the days turned into weeks, Eliza kept a close eye on the airline's progress. She attended follow-up meetings, reviewed their proposed changes, and provided thoughtful feedback on their initiatives. At the same time, she expanded her own efforts, partnering with advocacy organizations to launch a new program aimed at addressing systemic bias in the aviation industry. Through it all, Eliza remained resolute. The incident at Highland Terminal had been a catalyst, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story. The road ahead would be long, but Eliza was prepared to take it one step at a time. Weeks later, Eliza sat in the boardroom of her company, Carter Horizons, overlooking the sprawling skyline. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the massive windows, but inside, the energy was electric. Around the table sat her diversity and inclusion D&I team, her legal counsel, and representatives from several advocacy groups she had invited to join the discussion. It had been weeks since the incident with Stratus Airlines, and Eliza had been relentless in her pursuit of progress, not just within the airline but across the broader aviation industry. "Everyone," Eliza began, her voice calm yet commanding, "we've made strides, but we still have a long way to go. The programs we've implemented at Carter Horizons are a solid foundation, but we need to think bigger. I want our work to extend beyond these walls and impact the entire industry." Her chief diversity officer, Dr. Selena Hayes, nodded. The mentorship program has already been a success, she said, referencing the initiative designed to support underrepresented groups in aviation careers. The feedback from participants has been overwhelmingly positive, and several of them have already secured positions in the industry. Expanding the program is a logical next step. Agreed, Eliza said, leaning forward. But we can't stop there. We need to address the pipeline issues, getting more young people, especially those from marginalized communities, interested in aviation. That means outreach, scholarships, and partnerships with schools and universities, Selena added, making notes on her tablet. We could start with STEM programs at the high school level. Introduce students to the possibilities in aviation, not just as pilots, but as engineers, designers, and executives. That's exactly what I'm envisioning, Eliza said. But we also need to ensure that these young people see themselves reflected in the industry. Representation matters. One of the advocacy representatives, Angela Rivera, who led a nonprofit focused on workplace equity, spoke up. Representation is crucial, she agreed, but it has to be accompanied by meaningful inclusion. Otherwise, it's just tokenism. We need to create environments where people feel valued and supported. You're absolutely right, Eliza said, her expression serious. And that's where accountability comes in. It's not enough to open the door. Once people are inside, we have to ensure they're treated with dignity and respect. The conversation continued, ideas flowing freely as the group brainstormed solutions. At the far end of the table, Daniel typed furiously on his laptop, capturing every detail. Eliza felt a deep sense of pride as she listened to the passionate voices around her. This was what progress looked like: collaborative, intentional, and unapologetic in its pursuit of equity. When the meeting concluded, Eliza stood to address the room. Thank you all for your input today. This is the kind of work that creates real change, and I'm grateful for your commitment. Let's keep the momentum going. We owe it to ourselves and to the future of this industry. As the attendees began to file out, Daniel approached Eliza with a sly smile. You know, you just scared the entire industry into stepping up their game, right? Eliza chuckled softly. Good. They need to be scared. Complacency is the enemy of progress. That evening, Eliza returned to her office, her desk cluttered with reports, proposals, and drafts of public statements. She sifted through the papers, making notes and edits, her mind racing with possibilities. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her focus. It was a notification about another success story from their mentorship program, a young woman who had secured her first job as an aviation engineer. Eliza smiled as she read the message, feeling the impact of her work ripple outward. The path ahead wasn't just about rectifying what had gone wrong. It was about building something better. As the city lights twinkled outside her window, Eliza felt the weight of responsibility, but also the thrill of knowing that she was helping to reshape the industry for generations to come. Part 11. A Catalyst for Change. As Dr. Eliza Carter scanned the latest reports on her desk, her phone buzzed, pulling her attention from the documents. It was a message from Charles Linton at Stratus Airlines. Dr. Carter, I wanted to personally update you on our progress. The internal audit is underway, and we've already identified several areas for improvement. I'd like to discuss our next steps with you at your earliest convenience. Eliza smiled faintly. She had been keeping a close eye on Stratus Airlines' efforts, and while she appreciated their willingness to engage, she knew there was still a long way to go. She quickly typed a response, agreeing to meet later in the week. Setting her phone aside, she turned her attention back to the reports scattered across her desk. Among the documents was a handwritten letter from a young woman who had participated in Carter Horizon's mentorship program. The letter was heartfelt and inspiring. Dr. Carter, thank you for believing in people like me. Your program gave me the confidence to pursue my dream of becoming an aviation engineer. I hope one day I can inspire others the way you've inspired me. Eliza felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the words. Moments like this reminded her why she fought so hard. The challenges she had faced, the biases she had battled, the countless late nights spent working tirelessly. It was all worth it if it meant paving the way for others. Carefully, she folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, alongside similar notes of encouragement. Each one was a testament to the impact of her work, a tangible reminder of the lives she had touched. As the night deepened, Eliza continued to work, fueled by a sense of purpose that never wavered. The incident with Stratus Airlines had been a spark, but the movement it ignited was far larger than any single event. She was determined to see it through, to ensure that the industry she loved would become a place of opportunity and respect for everyone. Sitting in her office, with the city lights glowing beyond the massive windows, Eliza felt the weight of her responsibility, but also the thrill of possibility. Change was coming, and she was ready to lead the charge with unwavering determination. The momentum sparked by Eliza's efforts rippled across the aviation industry, creating waves of conversation and change. The incident at Stratus Airlines was no longer the focus. Instead, the broader issues of systemic bias, accountability, and fostering true equity and inclusion had taken center stage. Eliza had become the face of that movement, a role she embraced with grace and resolve. Her schedule became even more demanding, balancing her responsibilities at Carter Horizons with consulting on Stratus Airlines reforms and expanding her own initiatives. Yet she thrived under the pressure, her determination only growing stronger. One crisp morning, Eliza arrived at Stratus Airlines headquarters for a follow-up meeting with their leadership team. The company had invited her to review the progress of their internal audit and provide input on their proposed initiatives. Eliza was skeptical but hopeful. The road to change was long, but there were signs that Stratus Airlines was taking her feedback seriously. As she walked into the boardroom, she was greeted by Charles Linton and his team. Their expressions reflected a mix of nervousness and determination. The room was filled with documents, charts, and presentations, a visible effort to show the work they had been doing since their last meeting. "Dr. Carter," Linton said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming. We've made significant progress since our last discussion, and I'm eager to share it with you." Eliza shook his hand, her gaze steady. "I'm looking forward to hearing it." The meeting began with a presentation by Stratus Airlines' Chief Diversity Officer, a poised and articulate woman named Maya Thompson. Maya detailed the findings of the internal audit, which had uncovered a range of systemic issues: biased hiring practices, a lack of diversity in leadership, and inadequate training on cultural competency. "We've identified several key areas for improvement," Maya said, gesturing to a slide on the screen. "First, we're overhauling our hiring processes to ensure greater equity and transparency. This includes implementing blind resume reviews, expanding our recruitment efforts to underrepresented communities, and establishing diversity benchmarks for all departments." Eliza nodded, impressed by the level of detail. "That's a good start. But what about leadership? It's one thing to diversify entry-level roles, but real change happens when there's representation at the top." Maya smiled faintly. "We've thought about that too. As part of our long-term strategy, we're launching a leadership development program aimed at preparing employees from diverse backgrounds for executive roles. It's a pipeline approach designed to address the lack of representation in our upper ranks." Eliza leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "That's promising. But how do you plan to measure the success of these initiatives? What metrics will you use to track progress, and what accountability measures will you have in place if the benchmarks aren't met?" Maya nodded. "We're developing a framework for tracking key metrics, including hiring rates, retention rates, and employee satisfaction surveys. Additionally, we're tying executive bonuses to performance on diversity and inclusion goals. We believe this will create a strong incentive for leadership to prioritize these efforts." Eliza's eyebrows lifted slightly in approval. "That's a bold move. It shows you're serious." Charles Linton spoke up, his tone earnest. "Dr. Carter, your feedback has been invaluable in shaping our approach. We want you to know that we're committed to seeing this through." The discussion continued, with Eliza asking tough questions and offering suggestions for improvement. By the time the meeting concluded, she felt cautiously optimistic. Stratus Airlines still had a long way to go, but their efforts were a step in the right direction. That evening, back at her office, Eliza reviewed the day's events. The conversation at Stratus Airlines had been productive, but there was still much work to be done. The movement she had started was gaining momentum, and she was determined to keep it going. Her phone buzzed with another notification, a message from a mentorship program participant who had just been hired as an engineer at a leading aviation company. Eliza smiled as she read the message, a sense of pride and purpose washing over her. Moments like these reminded her why she fought so hard. Not just for herself, but for the future of an industry that had the potential to be inclusive and transformative for all. Part 12, Momentum and Milestones. Maya Thompson continued her presentation, her tone confident yet measured. As part of our long-term strategy, we're launching a leadership development program aimed at preparing employees from diverse backgrounds for executive roles. It's a pipeline approach designed to address the lack of representation in our upper ranks. Dr. Eliza Carter glanced at Charles Linton, who was watching the presentation intently. "And how will you hold your leadership accountable for these initiatives?" she asked, her voice steady. Linton straightened, clearing his throat. "We're tying executive bonuses to diversity and inclusion metrics. If leaders don't meet the benchmarks we've set, it will directly impact their compensation. We believe this will create a strong incentive to prioritize these efforts." Eliza arched an eyebrow, surprised but impressed. "That's a bold move. It shows you're serious." Linton nodded. "We are. And honestly, Dr. Carter, it's largely thanks to your feedback. You've pushed us to think critically about our approach, and we're committed to making these changes." The meeting continued, with Maya outlining more details about Stratus Airlines' plans, which included enhanced training programs, partnerships with community organizations, and a commitment to regular progress reports. Eliza asked tough questions throughout, challenging the team to think bigger and anticipate potential roadblocks. By the time the meeting ended, Eliza felt cautiously optimistic. As she left the building, she reflected on how far the conversation had come. Just weeks ago, she had been dismissed and disrespected at their terminal. Now she was sitting at the table, helping to shape the future of their organization. It was a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of holding people accountable. That evening, back at Carter Horizons, Eliza gathered with her team to discuss the next phase of their initiatives. They had just launched a new scholarship program for students pursuing careers in aviation, and the response had been overwhelming. Applications poured in, each one a reminder of the untapped potential in communities too often overlooked. "Look at this one," Selena Hayes, the Chief Diversity Officer, said, holding up an application. "It's from a high school senior who built her own drone from scratch and is working on a prototype for an autonomous delivery system. She says your story inspired her to pursue engineering." Eliza smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That's why we do this, to show them what's possible." The room buzzed with energy as the team discussed plans to expand the program, partner with additional schools, and host workshops for aspiring aviators. Eliza listened intently, her mind racing with ideas. She had always been a visionary, and now, more than ever, she was determined to use that vision to create lasting change. As the meeting wrapped up, Daniel approached her with his tablet in hand. "You're going to love this," he said, pulling up a social media post. It was a photo of a young woman standing in front of a plane, proudly holding a certificate from Carter Horizons' mentorship program. The caption read, "Thanks to Dr. Carter and her amazing team, I'm on my way to becoming a pilot. Representation matters, and so does opportunity. Breaking barriers, aviation dreams." Eliza felt her chest tighten with emotion as she read the post. Moments like this reminded her why she refused to let obstacles slow her down. The work was challenging, and the progress often felt slow, but it was worth it. She turned to Daniel, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We're just getting started." That night, as Eliza sat alone in her office, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The challenges, the setbacks, the victories, they were all part of a larger story, one that was still unfolding. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew she had the strength to walk it. Looking out at the city lights, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was coming, and she was determined to lead the way. The day had finally arrived when Eliza would board her jet again, not as a passenger humiliated by assumptions, but as a beacon of progress. The past few months had been a whirlwind of advocacy, meetings, and relentless work to ensure that the lessons from her experience with Stratus Airlines would lead to lasting change. Now, with her efforts bearing fruit, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The morning was bright and crisp as Eliza arrived at the private terminal. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different. The staff greeted her warmly, their demeanor respectful and attentive. She noticed subtle changes that spoke volumes. Posters highlighting diversity initiatives adorned the walls, and the energy among the staff felt purposeful and genuine. As she approached the gate, a young attendant smiled at her and said, "Welcome back, Dr. Carter. It's an honor to serve you today." Eliza returned the smile. "Thank you. It's good to be here." Stepping onto her jet, she saw a diverse crew waiting to greet her. Their professionalism and enthusiasm were evident, and it reminded her of what could happen when people worked together to build something better. As the engines roared to life, Eliza settled into her seat and looked out the window. She thought about the journey, how far she had come and how much further she was determined to go. The challenges weren't over, but neither was her fight. Change was in the air, and Eliza Carter was ready to soar. Part 13. A moment of pride. Posters celebrating the company's new diversity initiatives lined the walls of the terminal, giving the space a fresh, purposeful energy. Employees moved with a sense of focus, their demeanor reflecting a clear cultural shift. Daniel, ever at Dr. Eliza Carter's side, surveyed the scene with a satisfied grin. "Feels different, doesn't it?" he remarked, glancing around. "It does," Eliza replied, her tone thoughtful. "It's progress, and progress is worth celebrating." As they approached the boarding gate, Eliza was met by Rhea, the young flight attendant who had been part of the replacement crew during the original incident months ago. Rhea's face lit up as she recognized Eliza and extended a hand warmly. "Welcome back, Dr. Carter," Rhea said, her voice filled with sincerity. "It's an honor to serve you again." Eliza smiled, shaking her hand. "Thank you, Rhea. It's good to see you." Together, they walked to the jet, which gleamed under the bright morning sun. Inside, everything was immaculate. The new crew stood ready, their professionalism evident in every movement. Eliza couldn't help but notice how much more diverse the team was, a clear reflection of the changes she had championed. It wasn't just about appearances. There was genuine pride and respect in the way they carried themselves. Once Eliza was settled in her seat, Daniel handed her a folder filled with updates. "Before we take off, here's the latest on the scholarship program," he said. "We've awarded 50 scholarships this quarter and partnered with 3 additional universities for the next round." Eliza flipped through the documents, her eyes lighting up as she read the success stories of the recipients. Each one was a testament to the power of opportunity and the unlocked potential in communities too often overlooked. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with pride. "These students are going to change the world." "They're following your lead," Daniel said with a grin. "You've inspired them, Eliza." As the engines roared to life and the jet began to taxi down the runway, Eliza glanced out the window. Her thoughts drifted back to the first time she had boarded this plane under starkly different circumstances. The contrast was striking and reminded her of how far she had come, not just over the past few months, but throughout her entire career. When the plane lifted into the sky, Eliza felt a sense of clarity and peace. The journey wasn't over, but she had proven to herself and the world that change was possible. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of transformation, and the ripples of her efforts were spreading across the industry. During the flight, Eliza reviewed additional updates from her team. The leadership development program at Stratus Airlines was gaining traction, with several employees already enrolled. Meanwhile, Carter Horizon's mentorship initiative was expanding rapidly, with plans to launch a new branch focused on sustainability in aviation. Her vision was becoming a reality, one deliberate step at a time. As the jet cruised above the clouds, Rhea approached with a tray of refreshments. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you've done, and what you're doing, it means so much to so many of us. You've made us believe that we belong in this industry." Eliza looked up, her expression warm and kind. "Thank you, Rhea. That means more to me than you know." This work isn't just about me, it's about all of us. Together, we're building a better future. Ria smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude before she returned to her duties. Eliza watched her go, feeling a deep sense of connection to the people whose lives had been touched by her efforts. This wasn't just about breaking barriers. It was about creating a legacy of equity and inclusion that would endure for generations. As the flight continued, Eliza reflected on her journey. She thought of the mentors who had supported her, the colleagues who had challenged her, and the younger professionals she now mentored in turn. She remembered the obstacles she had faced as a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry. Each challenge had strengthened her resolve, each victory had fueled her determination, and each person she inspired reminded her why she fought so hard. When the jet began its descent, Eliza closed her laptop and leaned back in her seat, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a journey home, it was a journey toward a brighter future, for her, for the industry, and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the private hangar, Eliza felt a surge of pride. She had turned an act of exclusion into a movement of inclusion, and the impact was only beginning to unfold. When she stepped off the jet, she was greeted by a small group of students from the mentorship program. Their faces were alight with excitement, and they held signs that read, "Thank you, Dr. Carter. You inspire us." Eliza walked toward them, her heart swelling with emotion. She shook hands, exchanged words of encouragement, and posed for photos, knowing that these moments were the true measure of her success. This was her legacy, a legacy of empowerment, resilience, and progress. As the morning sun bathed the tarmac in golden light, Eliza Carter stood tall. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it, leading the way for those who would follow in her footsteps. Change had taken flight, and there was no turning back. Swelling with emotion, Eliza Carter shook hands, exchanged heartfelt words of encouragement, and posed for photos with the eager students. She knew these moments were the true measure of her success, not the accolades, not the headlines, but the lives she had touched and the doors she had opened. This was her legacy, a legacy of empowerment, resilience, and progress. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the hangar, Eliza stood tall, her vision sharp and her purpose unwavering. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it, paving the way for those who would follow in her footsteps. Change had taken flight, and for Eliza Carter, there was no turning back.